Yes. We need to get started. Are you ready, people? Yeah! Aren't you? So this is a really, really good day because, well, I have to introduce myself. I have this checklist that I have to go through. My name is Tone Larsen. I'm doing this in English because we're streaming it and because Mark Lewis is speaking in English, and so that, yeah, whoever wants to can see what we're doing, and you don't have to be Norwegian to understand it. So I work here at the Department of Welfare and Participation, and I have coordinated this day between the campus in Bergen and in Førde and here, so that altogether there are 8 classes participating in this lecture. Of course, I'd like to welcome you, all the students and staff and leaders, and also the people that are streaming this. The stream will be taped, so you can go back to check it. Yeah, we're really looking forward to spending the whole day with you. Some of you might have seen the program. It's on the website, hvl.no. But I'll go through it just briefly so that you know what the day is about. We begin with Mark, who is talking about addiction. And then after lunch, all the classes go into discussion groups. You will have some questions that Mark has prepared for you. And then after that, we meet in a plenum dialogue. And Mark will accept questions, and we will discuss, perspectives on addiction. And the final part of the day, there will be a panel where we have invited Sverre Nesvåg, who is director of, I don't know what's it called in Norwegian. Let me see. No, in English. Head of Research, Alcohol and Drug Research, Western Norway. And we also have Marit Schmidt, who is participating in Bergen. She's a neuroscientist as well. And we'll go into the views on addiction and how they impact treatment and how they can impact the person in recovery. So that's the whole day, okay? And as you see, we have Mark Lewis here, and I'm really happy to get him here all the way to Norway. I've been giving him a real tour, right? We went from Bergen to Sogndal yesterday, so he got to see the mountains and the fjords and the waterfalls. Yeah, it's great. And the reason why I have invited Mark here is because when I was responsible for a subject in the further education in addiction, I was presented with his book. Someone sent me an email and told me to read this. And the title was Biology of Desire on Why Addiction is Not a Disease. And it spoke to me, because it's been quite a challenge to face the idea that addiction is a disease, because these perspectives, they tend to medicalize something that, in my experience, can be handled in many other ways. So when I got that book on the curriculum, I finally felt that I had the power, to change attitudes. And we also saw that among the students in the further education, that they started talking about the people with addiction in a different way. And they gave us examples of approaching them more human. So that was really, that gave me a lot of motivation and inspiration. And so I also contacted you for this year's education, and you had a presentation on Skype, and that's how we ended up here. So I'm really happy to present Professor Michael Lewis, who will have the presentation this day. Yes. Do you want to say something about yourself? Yeah, go on.
Okay, you can hear me now? Yeah, good. Hi, it's nice to meet you all. And I've never been to Norway before. I have been living in the Netherlands for the last 9 years with my family, although I'm a Canadian. So I'm getting, closer and closer to moving to Norway. Uh, by the way, the Norwegians discovered Canada. I don't know if you know that. Eric the Red, the Viking, who is credited with coming to North America long before Christopher Columbus, right? He landed in Canada. Of course, we didn't have, McDonald's and Starbucks or anything, but they stayed for a little while, and they decided they didn't like it, and they came back here. I could see why. It's a very, very nice place. I like it here a lot. Beautiful country. Okay, so I'm going to get going. I have a couple of different talks kind of squeezed together, and I'll try not to overload you. So if I am saying things that you just don't understand, and if it's a quick question of clarity, just please ask or raise your hand or something. And otherwise, there will hopefully be time for some discussion, Q&A, with the panel during the panel session, yeah? Okay. And thank you very much to Tuna for inviting me. We've become friends through this process, partly because our understanding of addiction is quite similar, and partly just because we enjoy talking to each other. And so we had a lovely day yesterday, touring around and talking about many, many things. So the first half hour or so, I'm just going to suggest to you what are some different ways to think about addiction, different models of addiction, because it's a very controversial field, and people have a hard time agreeing on what is the best way to define it, to categorize it, to make sense of it. As Tuna suggested, the dominant model in most of the Western world is the disease model of addiction. Addiction is a disease. And since the 90s, since the decade of the brain, and since the development of new technologies for looking at the brain with MRI, fMRI, and so forth, now it's defined as a brain disease. Okay, so what happens is that when people take drugs, their brains change, and they become way too sensitive to certain stimuli that come from drugs or other things that can be abused, I suppose, and alcohol. These brain changes are considered to be evidence that the brain is now not functioning properly. It's pathological. Okay, it's changed in a fundamental way, just like your pancreas changes if you have diabetes or something. And so that's why addicts cannot be blamed for what they do. They cannot be blamed for taking drugs or drinking, because even though it's irrational and destructive and they get everybody in trouble, especially themselves, but it's not their fault because they have a disease. So this was an interesting change in the way we think of addiction, because before this model, it was thought that addiction really was just a sign of a bad character, a sign that you're a weak person, self-indulgent, don't have proper. It really comes from Protestantism, from a Christian fundamentalist background. They have good people and bad people, and people who sin and people who don't sin. And the addicts were obviously the ones who were sinning. So that really wasn't very helpful. And the disease model came along and said, well, it's not like that, because it's not their fault, and they're not just bad people. Rather, they have an illness. And this actually began in the 1930s with especially with the beginnings of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. That's really where the idea of addiction as an illness or an allergy came into focus. And then, as I say, it mutated and evolved over the decades since then. And then in the 90s, it became, okay, now we know where the disease is. It's in the brain. And since then, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars spent on research looking at little tiny brain processes, looking at the brains of people who are addicted to things and the brains of normal people, and saying, aha, look, they're different. Okay, see this thing here, this little bright spot here, and that bright spot over there, you don't see that in normal people, so that's a sign of the disease. And that's pretty much the story of the disease model. I'll be talking about that more, because as you already know, that is a model which I have spent quite a bit of effort to reject. So I will be talking about that more soon. Next is the choice model, and this is like an alternative, maybe the opposite end of the spectrum, and quite a few people say, no, it's not a disease. When people take drugs or drink, they're making a choice. Okay, and if they drink too much or if they take bad drugs, if they steal, if they lie, they do those things. It's a choice they're making. And there's been kind of a war between these two polarities, the way to see addiction. The choice model has an advantage in some ways because it puts the responsibility for the addictive behavior back in the person. And that can be a good thing, as I will also talk about. And also in the legal system, it makes things a lot simpler. If you do bad things because you're on drugs, or if you take illegal drugs, then you can be punished because you're making a choice. Like any other choice. To kill somebody or to rob, you can be punished. But you can't be punished if you have a disease, so this creates a completely different legal environment, legal problem. And the people who argue for the choice model, they don't say that people choose to become addicts, because that would be stupid. Nobody would choose to become an addict. It's not fun to be an addict, right? It might be fun to take a particular drug for the first 20 minutes or 3 hours or something, or maybe for the first few weeks, but it's not fun to be an addict, and people in the field know that. So that's not the choice. The choice is each time you do it, is it a choice or is it a compulsion, something that you have to do? So that's what the choice model is all about. Okay. Next model, it's not really a model, it's just a whole framework, is the social construction of addiction. And I assume that you folks are very familiar with the social construction of reality. It's a lot of what we learn these days in the social sciences is how societies and cultures construct ideas and frameworks and beliefs and understanding of human phenomena. They're not read out, they're not natural kinds, they're not something that that is obvious, but rather they're constructed through social feedback, through dialogue, through talking, through media, through every other form of communication. So there are many ways to take this. One way is to say that the whole idea of addiction is a social construction. In some cultures, the word addiction means nothing. Okay, so I spent some time in South America and exploring the wonders of ayahuasca and other rituals. And the really cool people there, the powerful people, were like the shamans and their buddies. First thing in the morning, they start chewing something, and they're smoking stuff, and they're spitting, and they're just consuming something all day long. And these obviously have chemical components. Coca, obviously, is one of them. They chew coca leaves, but they would never consider it an addiction. It's just like what, maybe even, I don't know, I know that people in Northern Europe depend a lot on coffee, and some people call it an addiction, and some people say that's silly. Again, social construction, yeah? So is the idea of addiction even meaningful? Secondly, what does it mean? If we believe in the word addiction, then what does it mean? And that can be socially constructed too. I've already presented 2 different ways of constructing it, but there's lots of other ways too. For some people, addiction makes sense because it's a way of dealing with poverty or oppression, okay? And so there is definitely a correlation between income and socioeconomic status on the one hand, or poverty and other forms of oppression, and addiction. So because of that, again, we can say that addiction is something which is manufactured by the society. It's created by inequalities. And it's a way of balancing the scales, maybe, or relieving a kind of stress which is produced by a social order. Okay? You get what I'm saying? Is it making sense? Yeah, good. Okay. Where else can we go? I have a buddy in South Africa. He's been an addiction expert for years. He was on methamphetamine. I forgot to introduce myself, didn't I? I'll do that soon. He was on methamphetamine for crystal meth for about 8 years, a lot. I myself was also an addict for about 5, 6, 7, 8 years, depending on how you want to define it, in my 20s. That'll be part of the introduction, which I forgot. And anyway, so a lot of us addiction experts, we talk about the days when we were addicts, the days when we were taking drugs or drinking or whatever it is. A lot of people in the addiction field started off with the experience and saying, okay, this is really fucked up. And let's see, once you get over it, let's see if we can help other people. So my friend Sean Shelley, and he doesn't mind telling the world that he had a very serious addiction to methamphetamine. So when people ask you, well, methamphetamine, doesn't that destroy your brain? Doesn't it eat away at your brain? Actually, no. Sean just completed his PhD. He has 3 international grants. He's on the Drug Reform Board of the United Nations. He does lecture tours all over the world. He's constantly traveling, giving lectures. So his brain is working very well. He did get a minor heart attack after all that meth, and that's not a good thing, but now he's healthy and his brain is fine. So there you go. But my point was going to be that he talks about life in South Africa, and he's a white guy, and he talks about how a lot of the young black men there have a really hard time finding jobs, really hard time finding employment. In fact, they're unemployable. Nobody wants them. So what do? They hang around and they smoke heroin. And in our culture, that sounds like a really nasty thing to do. But he says it's a very legitimate way for them to socialize. They smoke heroin, they're relaxed, they are, they communicate, they're not committing crimes, they're not shooting up, so they don't have those kinds of dangers. And it's a legitimate way for them to spend their time. Nothing wrong with it. Okay? In fact, there's even a society, I think it's called the Society for People Who Take Drugs. He told me about this, and they have meetings every couple of years, and apparently there's a lot of drugs at those meetings. But that's what they are, and and a lot of people, even in Western Europe and North America, say addiction itself is not bad, it's not evil, there's nothing wrong with it. The problem comes from setting up walls and barriers and obstacles so people cannot get the drugs that they want, just like what happened in North America, in the U.S. when prohibition came along in the 1929, was it? Do you know about that? Anybody know about that? In 1929 or so, the U.S. government, in all its wisdom, decided to ban alcohol. Okay? Well, that created a massive amount of crime, as you can imagine, because now people were getting their alcohol illegally. They weren't going to stop drinking. But now you had to go to these underground places and press the hidden doorbell, and the booze had to be taken over the border from Canada. And another funny thing is that people who used to drink beer started drinking whiskey and other forms of hard alcohol, hard liquor. Why? Because it's a lot easier to transport whiskey than it is to transport beer. Much less volume for the amount of alcohol. So there you create a social problem, but the problem is not created by addiction. The problem is created by a barrier that's erected against people getting a substance that they want to put in their body. So it's my choice. If I want to do this, I can do it. Why are you stopping me? So again, social construction. Where do the problems come from? How do we define them? And how do we make sense of them? Okay, next comes a learning model of addiction. And that's the kind of model that I espouse, that I write about, talk about, think about, is that addiction is something that is learned. Like other habits, habits are always learned. Habits do not come from birth or from before birth. We learn them through repeated behavior. And in the case of addiction, it's a very deep habit, obviously, a habit that's very hard to break. But of course, there are other habits that are very hard to break too, like racism or domestic violence or all kinds of things. Religion might be a habit that's very hard to break. So addiction, again, could be a habit that is learned through repetition, but it's a kind of repetition which has high emotional impact, yeah? So usually if you're just, if you, well, I had to rush through breakfast this morning, and I saw a lot of really good food, but I didn't have enough time, so I just grabbed a couple of crackers. And I didn't mind if I left the crackers behind. But if I had had a chance to get some of that delicious-looking fish, then I would have been much more concerned. I would have wanted to take it with me. So the strength of the attraction has everything to do with being drawn back to the behavior. And with addiction, obviously the strength of the attraction is a big deal. So in the developmental learning model, we want to understand how attraction and repetition and the brain work together to create a habit that's really hard to break. Okay? And I'm going to be talking about that approach a whole lot today, so I don't need to get into it in more detail right now. Except maybe to say that there's a bit of a war going on between a learning model of addiction and the disease model of addiction. It's a conceptual war. It goes on in journals. It goes on in treatment centers. It goes on in Alcoholics Anonymous, in AA. In AA, they say that's ridiculous. This is a disease. If you call it learning, that means you are saying that it's our fault because we learned to do this and we should stop. And it's not our fault because it's a disease. And if it's a learning model, then it must be flexible, but it's not flexible. And if you think it's flexible, that means you might think it's okay to drink again. But it's not okay to drink again, ever, because it's a disease, and if it's a disease, you're going to trigger it. Yeah? But a learning model is not about triggering a pathological process. It's about changing the cognitive approach to a kind of problem. So it's a completely different way of approaching the problem of addiction, and that's why this war continues to go on. And I would say that the disease model is very prominent, especially in the US right now, because they really, well, there's all kinds of reasons. The US is so fucked up in so many ways right now. Am I allowed to talk like that? But it's a very hierarchical medical approach that we can put addiction in this category, then we can put these people in this treatment center, this rehab center, whatever it is. We can use certain rules and regulations, and they have to follow them because we know what's wrong with them. And it's a very rigid way of dealing with addiction, whereas according to the learning model, there might be many, many ways of dealing with addiction because different individuals learn in different ways. So there's a lot of variation in how we approach treatment, therapy, counseling, and just the idea that people can change. Okay? And the idea that if you have a drink or have a joint or have even, a couple of lines of cocaine or something, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go back to being an addict. Okay, so those are some of the implications of those two models. And finally, this is kind of a specialized version of a learning model, which I think also makes a lot of sense. The idea that addiction is a kind of self-medication in response to traumas, to harm or suffering, especially in childhood and adolescence. Okay? But it doesn't have to be childhood and adolescence, because we know that a lot of veterans from wars, adults, come back from the war and become addicts, especially heroin addicts from Vietnam. There were tens of thousands of heroin addicts as a result of the Vietnam War. Why? Presumably because of trauma. So what does trauma do? Well, whether you're a kid or an adult, trauma will leave you with anxiety and depression. And anxiety feels horrible. To feel a state of anxiety is just a terrible feeling. And so people will take drugs or drink in order to relieve the anxiety. Well, that's simply self-medication. It's taking a medicine in order to feel better. And of course, that's what we do in psychiatry. Psychiatry, you give people antidepressants if they're depressed, and anxiolytics if they're anxious. And, we give them drugs to make them feel better. So according to this model, the way that people become addicted to drugs, illegal or legal, has to do with trying to get themselves to feel better. It's especially relevant in childhood because in many societies there is a great deal of adversity in early childhood when kids have no defenses and when they have not learned how to regulate their own emotions very well. So how do they regulate their emotions? Well, through their parents. But if their parents are abusive, or if their parents are neglectful, and we know there are strong correlations between abuse and neglect and later addiction. Again, the idea that trauma in early development makes you particularly vulnerable for addiction later on. And that's why when you're an adolescent, and there's a lot of anxiety and depression in adolescence, it's something, I forget the numbers, my wife studies this. I think it's something like 30% of adolescents reach the point of clinical depression at some point in their adolescence. 30% of the population. I don't know if you remember your adolescence, but a lot of it is kind of, not much fun. A lot of it is too much fun. But so these mental health problems tend to come out in adolescence, and of course that is when you are exposed to drugs of use, drugs of abuse, whatever you want to call them, and that's when you learn to take them because they make you feel better. Okay, so that is the self-medication model. That's the 5 models. Okay. All right. Should we take a couple of minutes or what? Or just go on? And sorry? Yeah, you can discuss or ask questions or argue. It's good time for it. Hmm? Yeah, I wasn't very clear, huh? Yeah. If you have questions, this is a good time for questions. You just raise your hand. And we'll throw you this ball, this square. So what do you think? Is it a level? Okay, we're going to go on again. Any questions about what I've said so far before we get into the main material? All clear? Okay.
There's a question up there.
Where?
So this is the funny ink. Are you ready? Can you help me? I'll throw it up here and then throw it to him.
Good throw.
Hello? Oh.
You're
You
talking
were
to a
talking about
box.
legalization of alcohol. I don't know, do you think it's a good idea to legalize other kind of drugs to get less addiction in the society?
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
You was talking about legalization about alcohol earlier, and it caused more problems with alcohol. So you think it's a good idea to legalize other drugs to get less addiction?
To alcohol?
No, with other drugs like. Do you
Cannabis?
think it's a good idea to legalize drugs? Not in a restrictive way, maybe, but but
Yeah, I think I understand.
yeah,
Because alcohol, as we know, is a very destructive drug.
yeah,
It causes a lot of problems. It causes a lot of traffic accidents. It causes a lot of violence. Whereas marijuana, cannabis, has almost no correlation to violence, right? So, and in fact, Canada has just legalized marijuana. So if you want to smoke a lot of dope, come to Canada. Also, I think about five or seven states so far in the U.S. have now legalized marijuana and hash. So that's pretty amazing. In a country which is so politically conservative in so many ways, that they are actually legalizing cannabis. So do I think it's a good idea? Yeah, I think it's a good idea to legalize soft drugs like cannabis for sure. I think they're less dangerous by far than alcohol. The question comes when you talk about drugs that are more addictive, more powerful, or more dangerous. So you go up the scale from cannabis to, I guess, drugs like ecstasy, then drugs like cocaine. Some people take people have normal jobs and normal lives. They still take cocaine recreationally on the weekend. Maybe that's okay, but it's probably not okay to take a huge amount and not to take it very often. Should that be legal? Should you need a prescription to get it? I mean, these are all the kinds of questions that people ask. And then when you get to the very, very serious drugs, like methamphetamine and heroin, should they ever be legal? And that's a very difficult question. But in fact, in some countries, for example, in Switzerland and Germany, and I think in the Netherlands now, heroin is made legal for people who have a very hard time quitting, and they've tried many things to stop. So they give up their driver's license, and they can get medical heroin at the clinic 2 or 3 times a day. They go in, they get their shot, they come out, and they live actually quite normal lives. So in those situations where it's well regulated and well supervised, actually even heroin might be okay to be legalized. But I don't want them to sell it at the corner store. I've got kids, and so I don't think that would be a good idea. Okay, does that help?
yeah.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the way I see addiction. For many years, I've thought about. Okay, let me give you a bit of an introduction. Wow, really close. Okay. So, like I said, when in my 20s, make a long story short, I was in California. I had been in a boarding school for 2 years. I came out of the boarding school quite depressed and anxious. I was very unhappy there. It was kind of a military school. I didn't come from that kind of background, and I was miserable. And then we moved to California. It was 1968, and the streets were flowing with drugs, LSD and marijuana and hash and all that kind of stuff, and it was lots of fun, and I thought, this is just great, and I love drugs, and I got into it deeply. And then I started getting into opiates, and even heroin and cocaine and stuff like that. And as I say, throughout my 20s, I went around and around and continued to use opiate drugs, and sometimes did a lot of illegal stuff, a lot of robbery and stuff like that. Not robbery, theft, stealing stuff from places that are locked up at night, or writing my own prescriptions, forging prescriptions. So I was pretty messed up. I was messed up enough that I got kicked out of school, I got arrested, I got convicted. I never did jail time except for a couple of nights, different times, and one night at a time, but lots of adventures. And then it was getting pretty old, and I tried very hard to quit. It takes a lot of effort sometimes to quit, and for me it did take a lot of effort, quite a few tries, and finally I succeeded. I was 30, just turning 31. I stopped completely, I stopped everything, and I did Tai Chi in the park at night instead, and I got back into school, and I got a degree. I got a master's and then a PhD in psychology, and then I got a job as a professor in psychology, assistant professor, and then I went up the ranks to full professor at the University of Toronto. So I did well. It just goes to show you that once an addict, not always an addict, and there's a lot of brain left over. So I've been studying child psychology, child psychopathology, and child emotional development, personality development, stuff like that for years. And then I moved over to start studying the brain. So the neuroscience of development, how does the brain change in development? And I studied that a lot. And we brought kids into the lab and we put on these big EEG nets and looked at them before and after treatment, or when they're angry or when they're anxious, and wrote articles about that. And that's the kind of stuff I did throughout my career. And then I decided I would like to write a book about the brain, in which the brain was a character, like in the story. Like the brain is not hidden in the background, but the brain is part of the story, okay? And I didn't quite know how to get started. I just thought it was a cool idea. And my wife suggested, why don't you write about when you were an addict, when you had an addiction, because that's a really interesting story, and there's lots of brain stuff there. And so I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And I brought out my journals. I had a big pile of notes that I had taken through all those years of all of my adventures, the fun times and the horrible times. And I started writing and wrote books and I studied the neuroscience of addiction in a lot of detail. I learned what goes on in the brain when people are addicted. And I learned what goes on in the brain when people take different drugs. And it's different when you take opioids or stimulants or psychedelics or cannabis or alcohol. Of course it's different. They have different effects. So different things are happening in your brain. And I studied all that stuff for, years. And then I wrote a book about it. I mixed it with my own memoir, so I talked about my story, but I put in a lot of neuroscience. And that book did fairly well, and a lot of people thought it was pretty fascinating to write about your own addiction and also what's going on in your brain at the same time. And then I just kind of became an addiction expert and kept talking, giving talks around the world, and I wrote another book, the one that Tona mentioned, The Biology of Desire, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, because I started to have a real point to make. And my point was that I really didn't like the disease model. I thought it was just wrong and stupid. And so I became kind of fighting for a kind of model, the learning model, and fighting against another kind of model, which I thought was not only kind of dumb, but also kind of destructive. So that's my story. And recently I retired from the university. I'm now 68, I'm old. So, but I was very happy to get out because, anything gets boring after a while. And so I do a lot of writing now. I see clients, I do psychotherapy, I give talks, and I have two 13-year-old boys at home. That's another long story, but so I'm pretty busy. That's who I am. Okay? Okay, so addiction as learning, narrowing brains in narrowing environments. So I want to think about how the brain changes in addiction, but I also want to think about how the environment, and I mean the social environment, changes in addiction. What happens in your brain and what happens outside your brain in the world. Okay, the brain disease model, here's the official definition. Addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. Brain imaging studies from drug-addicted individuals show physical changes in areas of the brain that are critical for judgment, decision-making, learning, and memory and behavior control. So your brain is really messed up. And in vulnerable individuals, people who become addicted, the disease of addiction is produced by chronic administration of the drugs themselves. That's the official model by the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the United States, which funds 80 to 90% of all addiction research in the world. The American Medical Association, the British Medical Association, SAMHSA, the WHO, I mean, you name it. This is the disease model. It's a classic orthodox model. Okay? And here's what's supposed to happen in the brain. And most of this I don't disagree with. Okay, so we just need to know about three parts. First, the prefrontal cortex, and especially I'm quite interested in the dorsolateral, the higher regions of the prefrontal cortex that are in charge of executive function and judgment, control, perspective taking, decision making, yeah? And we can call that the bridge of the ship. So you Norwegians know a lot about sailing, and the bridge is where you do the steering. Yeah? Okay, so that part is connected to the striatum, sometimes called the nucleus accumbens, and we can call that the motivational engine of the brain. It's like in the engine room. That's the part that makes you go. And the striatum has evolved for hundreds of millions of years. It goes actually really a long way back to even like to invertebrate animals. It's quite fascinating. But not exactly, but the chemicals in the striatum go that far back. I'm going to give, have I told you, I'm going to give a talk next month in Chicago about addiction in lobsters and flies. Really. Apparently lobsters and flies also have dopamine, but we'll get to dopamine in a minute. Anyway, so these two parts have to be connected, right? The motivational engine makes you want things, makes you want food and sex and money and drugs and nice clothes and whatever it is that you want, but that has to be controlled by the bridge of the ship, because you can't just do anything you want. You get in a lot of trouble if you do. So that's how intelligence evolved through the development, especially of the prefrontal cortex in humans, yeah, and in our other cousins in the great apes. And finally, this part down here, this is just a part of the midbrain, a part called the ventral tegmental area, which produces this chemical called dopamine, which I'm going to talk about more, which is kind of a fuel that goes up to the striatum and activates it when you see or hear or are getting ready to do something that is attractive, or that's not attractive and you want to get away from it. Anything that involves motion toward or away, then the striatum has to become activated, and it needs dopamine in order to narrow the range of attention to a particular goal, or a particular goal to get away from if there's a bear chasing you. And the chemical that it uses to do that is dopamine, which is manufactured right down there in your own brainstem. Okay, so in normal functioning, we see this kind of connection between the striatum and the prefrontal cortex. But in addiction, what seems to happen is that connection becomes somewhat more loose or more sporadic, maybe not so constant. Maybe becomes less, they become less connected, or they communicate less well because, of course, as we know, addicts do things that they probably shouldn't do, that are not very smart to do, but they do them anyway. So you get the idea of the striatum running free without control by the prefrontal cortex. And it gets so that it seems almost like there's a barrier or a wall between the prefrontal cortex, the smart part, and the motivational part of the brain. Okay, so that's kind of the standard disease model. Or standard brain model that goes with the disease model. Well, in fact, I think that model is basically correct. I think that those are really the things that happen. So I don't dispute the data. What I dispute is the way you interpret the data, and I'll tell you why. Premises of the disease model. First of all, first premise, brain change equals brain disease. Well, that's nonsense, because as a developmental psychologist, and it should be obvious to anybody, the brain changes massively from before birth until adulthood, and even in adulthood. The brain is changing all the time. It changes every time you learn something new. Brain is always changing. And these people actually say, look, the brain is changing. That means it's a disease. And I think that's absolutely crazy. Okay? Premise number 2. Drugs are what cause the change in the brain. So the particular change in addiction, that's a special kind of change because it's caused by drugs, yeah? No. Because drugs are not what cause the brain change. The brain changes that you see in addiction are also caused by gambling, porn addiction, sex addiction, which are not the same thing, gaming addiction, internet addiction, binge eating disorders, obesity. These are called the behavioral addictions, yeah? And the behavioral addictions show very similar patterns of brain activation as you see in drug and alcohol addiction, substance addictions. Looks the same. So it can't be drugs. It's not about drugs, obviously. Gambling is a very serious problem in many places. In Australia and the UK, people who are compulsive gamblers have an incredibly hard time stopping. And they spend all their money, they sell their house, they sell their children, just about, so they can keep on gambling. So it's highly compulsive, and yet it has nothing to do with any substances. So again, it's not drugs themselves that are the problem. Well, maybe it's something about addiction, brain change and addiction. Addiction is the special kind of thing. No, it's not unique, because the same brain changes you see in addiction For example, changes in the sensitivity of dopamine receptors, and we'll talk about that later, are seen with sports, wealth acquisition, politics, shopping, love and sex, religious experience. Even psychotherapy shows brain changes that look fairly that's the same. Any kind of major life change is going to produce brain changes that look similar to the kinds of changes you see in addiction, especially if it's a life change that has to do with new goals, new powerful goals, new ways of orienting to the world. Sex and love are particularly interesting. There's been a lot of research looking at love and sex in humans and other animals, and you need dopamine in order to mate. You need dopamine in order to approach, to be attracted, to mate, to want to connect sexually, and also to love, because that's where the attraction is. That's the attraction chemical. So it's necessary. So these processes then, we don't think of love as addiction. Well, sometimes we do. Some poets do. But and sometimes it can be like that because it might be very hard to stop being in love with someone who might be abusive, or it might be just kind of a piece of shit in some one way or another. And so that's a similarity or a parallel with something that we would never consider a disease. Premise number 4. Addiction is chronic? No, it's not chronic because people stop all the time. The statistics show that majority of addicts quit at some point in their life. And there are time frames for each of the addictive drugs. On average, people quit cocaine addiction in 4 years. Cannabis, if they take it addictively, 6 years is the median. Alcohol, it's 13 years. Tobacco, it's something crazy like 23 years. But these are developmental curves which show an average rate of quitting, okay? So people obviously quit. And in fact, the most interesting part of that is that most people quit without treatment. Most people quit without treatment. They don't go to some special place and they don't go to some special group. They grow out of it, and it's called growing out of addiction, maturing out of addiction, or it's called spontaneous recovery. And it's not very spontaneous. I mean, I quit without treatment, but it wasn't exactly spontaneous. It wasn't like I woke up one day and said, okay, I'm done. It's not like that. But I did try. I saw a counselor for a while. In fact, I had to because when I was convicted for theft, I was told I have to go to this place and see this counselor once a week, but it didn't help me at all. He's a nice guy. I enjoyed talking to him, but it didn't help me stop. I stopped later on my own, and most people do. Okay, interesting. Huh? And premise, without formal treatment. Whereas, again, most serious diseases get worse if they are untreated. And premise number 5, addiction destroys the will. And that's really one of the big ones, because the idea that they don't have a choice, that they can't make decisions, they don't have a will. So it's just not true because, for all kinds of reasons. But I'll get to that later on in the talk. Okay. The will is a very difficult concept. We don't really know how to talk about it. We don't know how to talk about choice. We don't know what it means to make decisions. When you come up to an orange light and you're driving and you come up to an orange light, are you going to go? I mean, I don't know about here in Norway, but in North America, you don't know whether you're going to step on the gas or step on the brake until the last moment. Depends if you're late or not, right? Or if you've got kids in the back seat and stuff like that. This is decision making, but it's not simple. And therefore, will is not a simple idea. And a lot of our decision making is not conscious, and that makes it extremely difficult to think about and very complex. So just to say that addicts have no willpower or no will or can't make decisions is really lazy thinking. Okay, so here's a sign that you see by the roadside in the US. And this exemplifies what I was talking about, this kind of conflict between the choice idea and the disease idea of addiction. It says, addiction is not a choice, it's a disease. And underneath it says, state without stigma. And then the MA is Massachusetts. That's where Boston is. Okay, stigma means shame. And the idea is that once you call it a disease, there's nothing to be ashamed of, because if you have cancer, you shouldn't be ashamed. If you have diabetes or if you have pneumonia, If you have a flu, you shouldn't be ashamed. It's a disease, right? So again, this idea that calling it a disease relieves people of this horrible stigma, the shame of being an addiction. And you can see how happy these people are that they don't have any choice. And so they don't have to be embarrassed. Okay, so I'm saying this is ridiculous. It's either a conscious choice or it's a brain disease, like those are the only options. There must be a lot of gray area in between those two. So that's what I think we need to explore. Something between simple choice and the idea of compulsion and a kind of momentum that is hard to control. Okay so far? Seriously? I do get a bit, what's the word? Feisty. Do you know the word? Like, what are they thinking? Idiots. Okay, in my books and talks and articles, I try to understand how people become addicted. These are my 2 books about addiction, and how they recover. Okay? And I have talked with thousands of people who have lived through addiction. I also have a blog. It's very active. I have about 90,000 readers per year. So a lot of these people have been through addiction, and they discuss things. There's a lot of online comments and chat. So it's I talk to a lot of people in addiction, and I'm really interested in their experience of addiction. Very interested, but I'm also interested in their brains. And really, what I bring to the game is to try to put these 2 things together: the experience and the neural events. The experience and what's happening in the hardware and software up here. Okay. So, how do we include the brain and the environment, the social environment, the perceived world, in our understanding of addiction? And I'm going to tell you how I think we can do that. Number 1, insert neural findings within a developmental psychology framework. So take the stuff we know about the brain and put it into what we know about child development, child and adolescent development. Okay, so neuroscience findings. There are changes in dopamine circuitry. There is a reduction in prefrontal activation. There are structural changes in the brain over time. These are things we know about the neuroscience of addiction. Yeah. So let's take all that stuff and put it in what we understand about development. And I use this branching tree diagram to talk about development, which you could also use to talk about evolution. But I'll get to that diagram later. For now, I just want to get the idea across. Developmental psychology, and especially the study of individual pathways. After all, that's the interesting thing. Not everybody becomes an addict. Some people do, some people don't. So we want to understand individual development. Okay, and that, of course, then we look for genetic and environmental impacts. So I want to put these disciplines together. So let's start. First of all, changes in dopamine circuitry. Dopamine, as I say, is the chemical that activates the striatum and narrows your attention toward a specific goal, like cocaine, or heroin, or drinking booze, or sex, or porn. Increased focus on immediate rewards. So we can call this the circuitry of desire. And what happens when you focus your attention on those rewards is you get what we call craving. If you desire something and it's not there in front of you, then you crave it, you want it. And craving is the single most common. Do you know the word craving? Is it familiar? Okay. It's the single most common word used about people by people when they talk about the subjectivity of addiction, when they talk about what it's like to be an addict. I crave it. I want it so much. I can't stop thinking about it. Okay. Well, I'm not going to crave this coffee because it's right here. Okay. But if it was like 2 floors down, maybe I would crave it. So you crave something which is not immediately available. And that is certainly usually the case with illegal drugs. Okay. So there's a few things that we can say about that. First of all, there's this process called delay discounting or now appeal. I call it now appeal. And here's how it works. The idea is that the value of a reward changes over time, the perceived value of the reward. the subjective value of the reward. So here's value on that scale, here's time on that scale, here's a little man who wants to be fit and slim. Yeah, if he keeps jogging, maybe he will. But he also really wants the piece of cake. Well, as the piece of cake gets closer in time, this blue line represents the perceived value of the cake. The blue line goes up very steeply, and as soon as it rises above the yellow line, now the cake seems more valuable than having a nice slim body like me. Okay? So that's called delay discounting, because the delay, waiting for the future event, discounts the value of that. It reduces the perceived value of that reward in the future. And this is a kind of cognitive distortion, if you want to call it a distortion, or a cognitive bias that we see in all mammals, including down to rodents, rats and mice, and even in some birds. And really, it's very simple, that what's in front of you seems more valuable than something that you have to, wait for. It's not that complicated. Okay, but in addiction, it's quite serious, because that might be the immediate reward, having some cocaine, and the maybe distant reward is to have a happy marriage, or to be presentable and, and have a normal, happy fairy tale life. And the idea is that the grip of the immediate goal outweighs the imagined future. Okay, so that's a real problem for addicts, because even though we all have that bias, if you continue to only focus on the immediate rewards, and you really stop focusing on more long-term rewards, that becomes a kind of cognitive style over time. Of course, children have that style naturally. They only focus on immediate rewards because they don't know how to think about things happening over time. They're not patient. Yeah? But for adults, we have learned how to be patient, and in addiction, it seems we unlearn how to be patient. Okay? We unlearn. We start focusing only on the immediate, and I think that is extremely difficult. So you never hear somebody say, let's do some cocaine next Wednesday. You will never hear anyone say that. Let's do some cocaine this afternoon, right now. I've got some. Come on over. Okay, that's the idea. This is called a delay discounting function. And this here is the proportion of patient choices. So patient choices are down at 0 up to 100% here. And this on the x-axis is the time you have to wait for the future reward. The longer you have to wait, half hour, 4 hours, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, the longer you have to wait, the lower the proportion of patient choices. All that means is the longer you have to wait, the more, the less patient you are. Okay? So why is that interesting? Because everybody has their own kind of ratio of patient and impatient choices. We are all some degree impulsive, some degree patient. Okay, and that's kind of personality style. So take this function, and everybody has got their own line, their own function, let's say, and take people into the lab. This is a study done at Radboud, where I've been working for a few years, and you put them in front of a computer screen, and you offer them choices on the screen. Would you like, €1 today, or 10 euros in 2 weeks? And the subject is sitting there and pressing buttons. I want this today. No, I can wait for that. And they press a certain proportion of patient choices and a certain proportion of waiting choices, of not patient choices. Okay? And that is their discounting function. And so you can see what it looks like. Then you take these subjects and you put this on their head. And this is called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what it can do is it can disorganize the cortex underneath where you place the monitor. And so right here you see it's placed on the prefrontal cortex, actually on the left, just a little bit left. This is actually dorsolateral, prefrontal, looks like to me anyway. Hard to know. And what happens when you turn on the power is that the discounting function that I just described, here's this guy's discounting function, it's blue, now it's been brought down to red. So you have actually changed the natural ratio of patient to impatient choices just by turning on the power. So what you've done in the lab is you've reproduced what happens in addiction. The capacity to wait has now been reduced because you are not using very well, shall we say, or using less well, these prefrontal areas for control, for judgment, and for waiting. So that tells us something about what the prefrontal cortex does and how it allows us to make decisions that are oriented towards the future rather than just today or tomorrow. So I think that's interesting, and I think that's important. And here's another interesting finding, that the motivational formula changes over months and years of addiction. What that means is, this is the work of Robinson and Berridge, and we can talk about the motivation to take drugs in two different ways. We can talk about the wanting drugs and liking drugs, okay? So sticking to cocaine, for example. At first, you like it very much and you want it quite a bit, but over the weeks, you want it more and more, but you like it less and less. Okay, well that's kind of interesting. Why would that be? So these scientists have done decades of work subdividing what happens in areas of the brain that are responsible for wanting and liking, and they are different processes. Liking has to do with pleasure and has to do with certain neurochemicals like opioids, internal opioids, whereas wanting has to do with dopamine. Wanting has to do with this chemical dopamine, which causes you to move towards objects and goals. So they've shown that wanting and liking develop in opposite directions, and wanting or craving is triggered by dopamine uptake. Okay? It's important because then you get people who have been in addiction for a number of years who really feel stuck because they crave it, something very badly, but it's not giving them much anymore. It's not giving them much pleasure or satisfaction. And so their lives are really empty. And they're stuck in this wanting cycle without getting much satisfaction or pleasure. And that's not fun. Any questions about that so far? Don't be shy. Clear? Okay. Okay, so more neural findings. The idea that there is a reduction in prefrontal activation, like I showed you. And this is one kind of structural change over time. Maybe the prefrontal cortex is changing over years of addiction, and that would be a problem. Okay, so what I want to say is that the cortex is always changing through this process called synaptic sculpting. So, as you know, neurons, brain cells, are connected at synapses. Synapses are the connections between brain cells. Synapses are where all the action is in the brain. Where one cell, the axons from one cell connect to the dendrites of the next cell. That little space there is the synapse. That is where activity moves from cell to cell to cell. There are roughly 20 billion neurons in the cortex, and they each have roughly 1,000 synapses, so that's roughly 20 trillion synapses. That's a lot. Lots of room for flexibility there. But something happens in addiction. And this is some finding that has been produced in several different labs. Here you get people who are addicted to alcohol, cocaine, or heroin. And as you see, with their years of use, they get a reduction in gray matter volume. Gray matter means cortex. Gray matter volume simply means synaptic density. The density of synapses is reduced over time with years of use. Okay? This dotted line here is the population average for synaptic density in every region of cortex. Okay? And there are certain regions, not the whole place, but there are certain regions which show a loss of synaptic density with years of addiction with different substances. Okay, well, according to the disease model, that looks suspiciously like a brain disease. Your cortex is melting. Okay, it's losing synapses. That can't be a good thing. But as a developmental psychologist and interested in the brain, I know that development actually is a two-way street. In development, what happens is that you gain some synapses and you lose other synapses. And over the time between birth and adulthood, first there is an increase in synaptic density up until about the age of 4, 5, 6, 7, and then there's a progressive decrease in synaptic density from that time up until adulthood. The main neural process between middle childhood and adulthood is a loss of synapses. So why would that be? Why would we want to lose synapses? Because if you have too many synapses, then activity patterns have many places to go. Too many options, too many choices, too many degrees of freedom. But if you start to get rid of the synapses that are not used very often, then you have more direct routes you have kind of synaptic highways or synaptic main streets that will get you more directly from point A to point B, from wanting to doing, from wanting to getting. Okay? So, for example, if you think of, I'll just leave it at that. And I just love this little movie. I'll just show you quickly. This is showing the loss of gray matter amount, which is, again, synaptic density, between the age of 4 years and 20 years. This is from average MRI data over many children taken once a year. And what it looks like is, I'll show you the picture first. Okay, so what you see is the brain is turning blue. It's not really turning blue. What's happening is this brain is moving from this color band, yellow and green, which is high synaptic density, okay, to blue, which is lower synaptic density. See, yellow and green are here at 0.2 millimeters down to I guess it's 0.2 centimeters, down to 0.1. Is it millimeters or centimeters? I don't know. Maybe it's just a ratio scale. Anyway, and you could look at this. I could look at this for hours because it's very interesting. Here's a 4-year-old, and this part is already blue. So this part is already reduced or matured by a loss of unnecessary synapses. Why would that be? Because this is the sensory motor cortex. And by the time you're 4 or 5 or 6 years old, you can walk and talk and climb trees and kick a ball, right? So the motor cortex is mature. That means it's lost unnecessary synapses. Same thing down here with this part of the emotional cortex down here. But what you see, especially here, and this is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the home of executive function, the home of higher order cognitive processes, that is one of the last areas to turn blue. It's not up until the age of 20 that this part and other parts that have to do with higher order cognition actually shrink down and lose unnecessary synapses. So now we have a different way of thinking about the loss of synaptic density. It may not be a pathology, it may not be an illness, it rather can be a natural process by which the brain becomes more efficient. Understand? That's how the brain learns. This is how the brain becomes a lean, mean fighting machine. Okay, so back to this study, back to this loss of synaptic density. Now, if we look at this in terms of normal pruning, if normal pruning is what is behind this reduced synaptic density, that might mean that these addicts are actually not using some synapses that other people are using. Why? Because they do the same thing every day. Because their lives are they're not maybe developing new skills. Each day is kind of like the day before. So they don't need all these kind of extra synapses for looking into the future, maybe. Okay, one way or another, they don't need them, they get rid of them, and then you would expect, of course, that if they recover from their addiction, there should be further changes in their synapses. And in fact, that is the case. So in this study, they looked at the number of weeks of abstinence from these drugs, and as the weeks of abstinence go up, 20, 40, about 50 weeks, about 1 year of abstinence, the synaptic density in these same regions goes back up and in fact crosses the population average and keeps going up. It's not a very pretty graph, but it does show a tendency that I think is very fascinating. So you might ask, they're developing or they are activating new synapses. What are those new synapses doing? We don't know. But maybe those new synapses are being devoted to new skills for self-regulation, for futuring, for decision-making, for planning, for control. Okay? Because when people stop being addicts, they learn new skills. Just like addiction is kind of a new skill, maybe not a very good one, but it's still a kind of a specialization. Recovery is also a skill and requires effort and requires learning. So maybe that's why. But the main point is that this is not terminal damage. This is not a pathological process by which the brain is melting. It's just not the case at all. Rather, it's a temporary process by which you have a change in synaptic density according to the lack of use when you repeat the same pattern day after day and week after week. Okay, so, all right, onward. Now, let's take these kinds of brain findings, these kinds of what we know about the striatum and dopamine and the prefrontal cortex, and let's insert them into a developmental psychology framework. Tona, this talk is supposed to go till what, 11:15, yeah? Yeah, okay, it's all good. Okay. All right, so now we talk about developmental psychology. Here's my diagram that I've been using for years. I quite like it. And here's how it works. Sorry, I'll get to that in a minute. The first thing to say is that, as I mentioned before, there are really powerful environmental effects in childhood and adolescence that predict to later addiction. Okay, and this has been well studied. ACE scores are adverse childhood experiences, ACE, adverse childhood experiences. And these include abuse, which could be physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, parental divorce, maternal depression, maternal alcoholism. These, you get a point for each one, okay? And the more points you get, the higher your ACE score. That means the more shitty your childhood was, childhood or adolescence. And you know, you can count your own. I mean, so when I count mine, I get a score of about 4 or 5. It's pretty high. So, yeah, it's not surprising that I got into some drug use. Anyway, here's the correlation between higher ACE scores and adult alcoholism. You can see it's a linear correlation. It's very strong, very direct. And here it is with with injected drug use. That's actually more of a parabolic function, or so that if you've had a particularly nasty childhood, your chances of using heroin, for example, injecting drugs, goes up dramatically. Okay, and this is well known in the field. Anyone who injects drugs, whether it's heroin or methamphetamine, 9 times out of 10, you can point to what went wrong in their childhood and adolescence. There's a lot of abuse and neglect in the literature. Gabor Mate is famous for, he's an author who talks about child neglect and abuse, incest in particular, in some of the native communities, really poor native communities in Canada, where the culture has just been destroyed. And people are just really, family life is just completely messed up. And those people have a high incidence of injected drug use. Okay, why? Because they are so deeply uncomfortable within their bodies, within their minds. They're so deeply uncomfortable. They'll try anything, and heroin makes you feel better for a while. Okay, so those are the correlations. So we know that adverse childhood, adolescent experiences predict to addiction. Now the question is why? How does that happen? What goes on? And we can call it self-medication, but I want to think about it in more detail. So here's this branching tree of mine. This is birth, this is adulthood, and what you get with child development is you get different kids develop different pathways, just like branches along a tree. Okay, so this kid might be, I don't know, do you know about attachment theory? How many of you know about attachment theory? Ainsworth Bowlby, yeah? A few, not many. Again, how many of you know about attachment theory? Please raise your hand. Not so many. Okay, so in childhood we can divide kids at the age of 1 into avoidant attachment, secure attachment, and resistant attachment. There's 3 distinctions you can make at a 1-year-old. But you can't make 10 distinctions or 20 distinctions. They don't work. They're not stable. They don't last. But when a kid is, well, an adolescent or an adult, you can make many distinctions. There are all kinds of individual differences which we can see later in development. So we want to think about these differences as branching out of these pathways as kids develop. So here's this avoidant kid, and he goes along being, kind of like a little bit aloof and standoffish, and doesn't really cuddle very much, doesn't make that much eye contact. And then when he goes to school at age 5 or 6 or something, there's a big change. Now he's got a social environment, a classroom, and now he could become a leader because he's socially kind of tough, right? Or he could become isolated, or he could become something else. He could become a bully. Those are 3 possible choices. So now we've seen a branching of personality styles at a certain point in development. And this secure kid could become, when he goes to school, she goes to school, she can become popular, she can, because she's got, normal, healthy adult attachment, or could she become more quiet, more of a follower, or she could become more of, something else, more, likes to do things on her own. And so the question is, what are these developmental transition points? Well, there's different ways to define them. We can talk about stage theory, we can talk about things like language development at age 18 months to 2. When you get language, everything changes, okay? Everything. You start to demand, you start to say no, you start to resist, you start to understand rules, you start to break rules. So that could be one of those points at which personality pathways start to branch out. When kids go to school, another point at which personality pathways become more specific, more articulated. Yeah? Adolescence, big one. Puberty, obviously. My latest generation of children, my 13-year-old twin boys, are just 13, and so they're just about to go through puberty, just beginning. They're busy smelling their armpits to see if they can smell anything. Come on, that should make you smile at least. Wake up, come on. Looking for hairs, not finding much yet. But they are, of course, advancing towards puberty, and very quickly they'll be there. And their social relations are changing hugely, and their relations with their parents are changing hugely. So they're becoming new people, yeah? And I think of that as another branching of the developmental pathway. And even though they're twins, they're very different. They're not identical twins. So one of them is kind of lazy and sloppy, but he's quite popular and he's very sweet and he makes friends easily. Another one is much more clever and kind of looks at people and understands social relationships quite well, really quickly. He gets social relationships. He's very good at language and stuff. Well, we didn't know that 3 years ago. We didn't know about those branchings. So you see, these branchings are undetermined by the past. They're not built into the genetics, okay? They're not built into the genetics. There's some kind of magical process by which things change and develop in an evolutionary way because of an interaction between the individual and the, starts with an E, environment, right? That's how evolution happens. That's how development happens. Okay. They're very quiet people. All right, so as this developmental articulation happens, I want to say that the brain becomes more and more refined, because as you become more of the person you are, you're losing synapses, you're pruning away the extra synapses, and you are now, you're a sports guy or girl, or you're more studious, or you're a musician type, or you like to, play particular kinds of video games or other kinds of video games, or, whatever. You like Facebook or you don't. So there's a certain narrowing of the brain, narrowing in the sense that there is a closing in of synaptic possibilities, so to speak, as you become more and more of the person you become. That's how we grow. And that's why psychotherapy is so difficult. You go to psychotherapy for 10 years, you come out and you're exactly the same. Because adults don't change very easily, okay? Because a lot of the growing is already done, but they do change in some ways, and we'll talk about that soon. All right, so as this developmental changes going on, and as the brain is becoming more narrow, I want to think specifically about pathways that lead to addiction. Let's say that's the red path or the yellow path. That's the pathway that leads to addiction for that individual. What is going on? First of all, these self-constraining or self-closing in developmental pathways are learned in response to environmental challenges, because that's how everything is learned. Environmental challenges, environmental opportunities. Okay, whether it's music lessons, whether it's being beat up in the playground, whether it's being complimented by your teachers or your parents, all these are environmental challenges and opportunities. They impact on the developing organism, they impact on the brain, on the way you see yourself and the way you behave. That's simple, right? Well, it's also the case, though, that you are also impacting on the social environment. The way you are is impacting on the people around you. The avoidant child who is not very cuddly, his mother or father is going to say, well, you don't seem to like me very much, so okay, fine, go do your own thing. And the child who's extremely needy and demanding is, maybe demanding too much from parents, and so the parents are saying, okay, take it easy, let's just, whatever. I mean, maybe I'll give you anything you want. That's not good parenting. Or, learn how to control. Or just, if you need to be distressed, be distressed. So the individual personality as it develops impacts on the social environment. And the thing I want to emphasize is the social environment then impacts back on the individual in the ways I've just described. You affect the people around you by who you are, and the people around you affect you in turn. So this is a narrowing loop within the organism, within the individual, but also within a particular social niche, a social niche that you develop around you as a particular kind of person. Okay, so let's think about that in terms of addiction. In terms of addiction, if you become more interested in certain activities, drugs or alcohol at the age of 15 or 14 or 16, whatever it is, then you impact on your social environment. Some kids don't want to be with you. Other kids do want to be with you. Other kids find you to be exciting and fun, and those are the kids you tend to hang around with. And the more you hang around with those kids, the more you are likely to continue drinking and using drugs. So that's this reciprocal causal connection. You impacting on your social environment impacting back on you. Okay? Relations with families close down if you get into drugs. I mean, most people who've gotten into drugs and alcohol in a serious way end up leaving home early or running away or having horrible interactions with their parents, right? So separate from the parents, separate from that source of security, and then you feel very much alone. And then the people that you hang out with are, again, other people who do drugs or get drugs or deal drugs, okay? Or if it's other behavioral addictions, for example, gambling, you hang out with other people who do gambling. It's pretty simple. You build your social environment, and your social environment builds you. So that's really what's behind the title of my talk, Narrowing Brains in Narrowing Environments. Narrowing brains, a more and more specialized brain within an environment that becomes more and more specialized. And I had to go to that kind of a model because talking about what's happening in the brain isn't enough. It's not enough to explain why addiction is so hard to quit. The only way to explain why addiction is so hard to quit is because addicts run out of options. They run out of opportunities to develop new ways to meet their needs because they have constructed an environment which is very specialized. It's very restricted, and it's very much built around their addiction. And that's why it's hard to quit. Okay? And that's why more progressive ways of dealing with addiction in treatment centers and rehabs and so forth, instead of giving them methadone, for example, or maybe with methadone, help them to connect to other people, help them to connect to other activities, help them to expand that social environment, which has become so incredibly narrow. And by the same token, help them to think outside of the present tense. Okay? It's not just about we're going to get high this afternoon, it's about tomorrow and next week. Can you start to think about next week? Next week we're going to go to the coast and whatever, go hang gliding or something. And so, oh, geez, that would be fun. Okay, so you're stretching and stretching and stretching the environment, both in terms of time and also in terms of social diversity. So, now let's just think about all this as one feedback loop. Here's a classic feedback cycle in emotional learning. You got wanting and you got solutions. I want to feel good, I want to feel okay, I want to feel less anxious or depressed. I could watch another movie on Netflix, I could play another video game, or I could get some ecstasy or cocaine or smoke some dope or drink, right? So wanting leads to particular solutions, and the more you want, the more you think about those solutions, and the more you want them, and finally you go and get those solutions. You actually go and get the drugs or the porn or whatever activity it is, and the more that happens, again, the more you are creating an environment around you, okay, by your behavior. And that is then creating also more and more specialized emotional needs that are now focused on the only thing that makes me feel good is opiates. A couple of other things, but that's the only way I'm going to actually feel comfortable is if I have some of these drugs inside me. That is a very particular connection with a goal between a problem and a solution. And the environment now gets the print of that solution. That's the only kind of environment I'm interested in. How can I get some? Where can I get more? How can I get the money to buy it? Where can I find a doctor to prescribe it? Yeah? Okay, so you get, again, feedback between what's going on inside the individual and what's going on in the environment. Both of them are narrowing. Now, I'm going to take you into the brain, and this is just a cartoon. Here's how this cycle might look in brain activation. Trigger is for the sight or sound of whatever paraphernalia or pill on the bathroom floor, whatever it is, that is perceived by the sensory cortex. You look at that, you say, oh yeah, that reminds me about getting high. And so now you think about it and you imagine it and you remember how much better you felt, well, maybe at least when you first started getting high, maybe not last week, but a couple of years ago. And all that stuff is going on in your temporal cortices and these areas that are in charge of memory and association. Meanwhile, the midbrain is sending dopamine up to your striatum, yeah, and your striatum is getting activated, and now you got craving. Okay, you got that, what I talked about, that emotional, motivational, focusing in on the particular goal. And the more the striatum becomes activated, it sends signals back to the midbrain to suck up more dopamine. So all of these neurobiological approaches to addiction, they always emphasize there is more dopamine released by the drugs. It's a disease because there's all this dopamine that's released by the drugs. Well, you get just as much dopamine if you meet your girlfriend after 6 months, probably more. It's just about being in touch with something that you want, anticipating something that you love or that you like, at least. Okay, so that's going on. Meanwhile, the frontal cortex is coming online and thinking about what do I do about it, projecting, planning, preparing. Should I get some? Should I not? I better not. If I do, my husband's going to get really angry with me. I'm going to lose my children, etc. Okay, maybe I better quit, go back to another AA meeting, etc. And you got a lot of feedback between imagery and plans or half-formed actions, and finally you say, fuck it. This is actually a technical term, fuck it. In the addiction literature, everybody knows what it means. It's the time in which you finally say, fuck it, I'm just going to get high. And partly it's because the anxiety of decision-making is just so agonizing. Okay, so then you activate the motor regions, and you go and get stuff, and you get high, and you feel better for a little while, and then it fades. It fades away. Okay, and then you feel crummy. You feel depressed, you feel loss, you feel shame, you feel empty, all that stuff. And you probably feel worse than you did even before you started seeking the drug. And this is, of course, the trap of addiction, is that you take something to make you feel better, which actually makes you feel worse. Everybody knows that's the trap of addiction. Okay? So that's what's happening in the brain. And every time you go through that cycle, you are activating and manipulating and changing synaptic connections between those 20 billion or more neurons. okay? Because you continue to learn, you continue to adapt, you continue to become more and more specialized as an addict, if you like, okay? And so you are developing a nervous system tuned to a particular world, particular activity, particular social group, and not attuned to all the other parts of the world that us normal people are attuned to, like having, getting pleasure from watching movies and eating pizza and having sex and stuff like that. Okay, so that's the specialization that's going on inside the brain. What's happening outside the brain? Again, let's pay attention to that. As this is happening inside the brain, outside the brain, your social environment continues. It's hard to draw pictures of this, but you continue to attract a certain kind of people and maybe repel other kinds of people, and you develop a life that may be more isolated in many ways, more cut off, more limited. There are fewer choices, fewer opportunities for reinforcement, poor relationships with your family of origin, etc., etc. The environment is closing in around you. As the nervous system is getting more specialized, the environment is also becoming more limited, and that's the end of the story. That's what happens. Okay, so that's how I see it. That's my model. And this is pretty much almost the last slide. So here's just kind of an overview of the model using boxes and arrows. Psychologists love boxes and arrows. So I want to draw attention to the reciprocal causal processes, reciprocal, between what's happening in the developing child, adolescent, adult, and what's developing in the social environment. One causes the other. Who I am causes what's happening around me. What's happening around me causes who I am. So I see, here's a cognizing and feeling brain, and it's giving rise to a present, relevant, engageable world, social environment. As you develop, you get more specialized cognizing brain, a more specialized environment, a more specialized brain, a more specialized environment, and so on and so forth. Both become more narrow, so to speak, more limited, and that's why addicts get stuck. That's why addiction is a process of getting stuck, both in here and out there. And that's it. Conclusions. Severe addiction is like a disease in some ways, but neurobiological change does not equal pathology. There's all kinds of ways to understand change in the brain that have nothing to do with disease or pathology, and that's what we need to study. So let's use insights from neurobiology to explain addiction as a developmental process that corresponds with the shrinking of environmental opportunities. Okay, so that's that part. Thank you. Tack. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
So we'll have a 15 minutes break. We'll be back here in 11:35.
Okay, I'm told I should start now, so I'm going to start. I would like the second hour talk, or almost an hour, is about recovery, getting out of addiction, or treatment and stuff like that, clinical issues. I want to wake you people up. I'm complaining to Tuna that you're so dead. I mentioned puberty and smelled my armpit, and nobody smiled. Like, what's that about? So come on, talk with me, think with me, okay? I know the first hour was theoretical, it was a little bit dense, yeah, but I'm sure that it was comprehensible. I think it was, and if it wasn't, you should have asked me questions. Okay, please, if something is you don't understand, if I'm going too fast, just raise your hand and ask a question. All right? All right. Okay, so come on. Oh, here we go. So using the kind of learning model that I've talked about so far, I want to ask, what are the implications for recovery from addiction? Recovery is a word that I don't like to use very much, and other people who also have a more progressive, I would say, approach to addiction, like me, also don't like the word recovery. Why? Because, well, why do you think? Yeah. Yeah, because we don't see it as a disease. If it's not a disease, then the word recovery doesn't make any sense. Thank you. Okay, you recover from a disease, but if it's a cognitive bias or habit or a set of cognitive adaptations, then the word recovery makes no sense. Rather, I would like to talk about it as unlearning or relearning or learning other ways of dealing with your needs and moods and difficult emotions and habits. Okay, so just amass these pictures. Normally what you see in the media is you see pictures of really people in very extreme addiction. Yeah, this is what you get on the media. They look pretty horrible, right? They look pretty horrible. But, you have to realize that's one end of a spectrum. That most people who are addicted to something are not in that bad shape. I've been doing psychotherapy with addicts for the last 4 or 5 years. All of them have jobs. I think all of them have families, yeah, pretty much. They're functioning. And most addicts are functioning. But, so there's all kinds of gradations. A lot of people can have addictions and still lead quite interesting lives. But then you get these guys, people who are really in a lot of trouble. And as I said before, most people do recover from addiction without treatment, without professional help. But some people don't. Some people do need help, and some people need it really badly. So we want to think about what are the ways to help people get past their addictions. Okay, so according to the disease model, the orthodox disease model, what do we say to the addict who comes for help? We say, you have a chronic disease that you will never be free of. You have lost all control, and therefore you can't be blamed for your actions. Well, that's a good thing. Now you can do anything. People won't stigmatize you for being immoral. That's a good thing too. Right? But they will stigmatize you as someone with a mental illness, forever different from normal people. So that's the trade-off. And because you have a disease, you must seek treatment. And generally, in the Western world, you seek treatment from medical authorities. The trouble is that doctors don't actually know how to treat addiction. Doctors don't have the skills to treat addiction. They don't have the tools. Well, doctors are good at treating diseases, and they're okay at giving drugs for some kinds of psychological issues like depression, even though antidepressants don't work very well, as we all know now. SSRIs have very strong placebo effect. There are all kinds of problems with psychiatric medications. But with addiction, what have you got? Well, you got methadone, and you've got Subutex or buprenorphine, and you've got, what else? What do you call it, that stuff? Huh? The stuff, the opiate antagonist. The first two are agonists. Naltrexone. So there's a few drugs that will do some things, but really the main things are methadone and Subutex or Suboxone. I'm not sure what they call it here. Which both of those are strong opioids. So they give strong opioids to opioid addicts. Well, obviously that doesn't cure or help their addiction. What it does is it gives them something legal that they can continue to take. Well, that's better than having to go out on the street and be prostitutes for hours before you get enough money to buy heroin. It's a lot better to be able to get your methadone. And so I'm not talking against methadone or against the use of maintenance opioids. I think they're incredibly important for saving lives, especially, I know it's been a problem in Norway, that there's been a lot of overdose deaths and so forth, so that's another problem. Whereas with methadone and Subutex, you can control the dosage and so on and so forth, and so it's a huge advantage. But you're not treating the addiction. What you're doing is you're dealing with the chemical dependency and trying to bring it into a certain limitation. So other than that, doctors, what are they going to do in that 15-minute period? And I've talked with quite a few addiction doctors. And they don't really know what to do. So I think the disease model of addiction isn't just wrong. I think it also has a lot of problems, and I'm going to talk about some of those problems. Why the disease model fails addicts. First of all, the disease model calls for medical treatment as the primary intervention. As I just said, that really doesn't get to the problem at all. It gets to some of the associated problems. By the way, I should also mention that the only thing addiction doctors are used to treating actually is opioid addiction, because nothing else comes close to their expertise. Addiction to psychostimulants like methamphetamine or cocaine, there's no drug that can help in any way. There's no drug that can take the place of cocaine. And with alcohol, I mean, you're kind of stuck with, again, the name is escaping me now. What is this? Antabuse. Well, what's the chemical name of antabuse? Antabuse. Oh, you don't? Okay. It's a drug that people take which makes them nauseous when they drink. Okay. So. Okay. So yeah, that's okay. Except that if you really want to get drunk, you stop taking it for a couple of days and then you're fine. So that's not really very helpful either. So again, doctors, not so much they can offer. Secondly, medicalization makes addicts into patients. So what does it mean to be a patient? You're a doctor, you're a patient. Well, first of all, patients hand over control to the professionals. They're not making the decisions anymore. Okay? So if your doctor tells you you got a chronic disease, you say, oh, that's too bad, it's chronic. I wasn't aware of that. And you're kind of stuck. I saw this billboard on an airport somewhere, I think it was Australia. I'm not just a GP, that means general practitioner, family doctor. I'm not just a GP, I'm your specialist in life. Well, my brother's a GP, and he's no specialist in life. That's bullshit. I mean, doctors do what they do, and sometimes they do them very well, but they're not specialists in all kinds of things. So the idea that they should be at the top of the dominance hierarchy or in the front line when it comes to addiction treatment is just misguided. And often these rehabs and residential treatment centers can get away with charging $50,000 to $100,000 US dollars a month, is because they boast about having doctors on their staff. Okay, so yeah, you're not a specialist in life. Okay, how can we do better? So I'm just going to tell you about 5 things that I can think of, ways of thinking about addiction with clients, I call them clients, obviously not patients, with clients to help them move beyond their addiction. First of all, engage the dopamine system in seeking alternative rewards. Okay, so I've talked about dopamine and the way the dopamine is drawn up into the striatum or the nucleus accumbens when people are focusing on addictive rewards. And the attention is focused and motivation is surging forward and craving is on and you just want to get it. You want to do it. You really want it and it's hard to stop thinking about it, okay? So what are you going to do about all that dopamine? You can't ignore it. Well, craving is always specific to a goal, but addicts also crave other goals than just drugs. They also crave freedom. And really, the more you feel trapped in addiction, the more you crave freedom. So that's a goal which, if you can make it tangible, if you can make it something which you can imagine and think about, that's a pretty good start. And they crave self-control because it's something that they've lost. So these can be personal goals, but they can't be personal goals if you're a patient and you're taking orders from somebody else because you don't have personal goals. You're just following instructions. So the way I see that is help them own these goals. Help them be their goals, not the goals of the treatment center, not the goals of the doctor, but their goals. So it's an old slide. What happens when you give the steering wheel to your kid? So you got an old car and you give it to your teenage son or daughter, and you say, okay, you can have this car, or whatever it is, or you can drive my car. And suddenly they care. They care about how much gas is in the tank, how much air is in the tires. They care about everything because it's their car, or because they're driving it, or because they're in control. It's a very simple thing. But if it's your own goal, you care a lot. If it's somebody else's goal, whatever, right? So this is the kind of expression. I realize how old this looks like something from the 60s. But I want to say, okay, dopamine. So last night I put in a picture of one of my kids, This is how he looked after, we rented a boat in the Netherlands and let him steer. And this is how he looked after steering the boat for a while. Very happy, obviously, and proud. Versus other goals that may not be their goals, but may be our goals, do not elicit the same kind of energy or enthusiasm or joy. So those are my new additions. I have a client named Jane. She's about a 40-year-old British woman, and she was a heroin addict and a prostitute for years. She's endured rape and violence, had a pretty horrible life for quite a long time. Of course, her parenting was pretty inadequate. She was left in children's homes, sort of abandoned by her parents, which is very often the case, one way or the other. Anyway, she's now in pretty good shape. She was on heroin for 10 years or so. Now she takes codeine, which is a fairly mild opioid for pain, and she gets a prescription from the doctor, and she takes, about 8 or 10 tablets a day. And she has now been working on getting off it. So she got down from 10, she was taking, when I first started seeing her, she was taking 10 tablets a day, plus getting a lot of extra from the drugstore, which was mixed with paracetamol. And if you take too much paracetamol, it really screws up your liver, it toxifies your liver. So a lot of opioid addicts in the Western world are taking these codeine, paracetamol combinations and getting liver damage, not from the opioids, from the paracetamol. It's kind of stupid. Anyway, so Jane was taking lots of that, plus her 10 30 milligram codeine tablets she got from her doctor. Now, as of 3 weeks ago, she was down to taking 4 tablets a day. It's a tremendous, and she did this all by herself. She wanted to cut down, and she cut down bit by bit by bit. It's called tapering, and that's what you have to do with opioids so you don't get bad withdrawal symptoms. She was very scared of withdrawal symptoms. She remembered what it was like to get withdrawal symptoms from heroin, something called restless leg syndrome, lots of anxiety and sleeplessness and nausea and cramping and vomiting and the whole works. So she was scared of that. So she took herself down gradually. And, I was able to talk with her about it, but I didn't do much. This is all her own choices. And then, just recently, she went to her doctor, and she got a new doctor. And the doctor says, I'm going to help you with your detox. I'm going to help you with your detox. Oh, great, thanks. Okay. Yeah, so, I want you to come and see me every week, and every week you're going to go down by 1 tablet. Yeah, but, I'm actually working on this myself. Yeah, but we're going to do it this way now. And once you go down by 1 tablet, you can't go back up. So every time we take 1 tablet off the record, you can't go back. So suddenly, there's a set of instructions. Can you imagine what happened? She basically left the practice. She went back up and started taking more codeine. Got it from another doctor, and she just said, fuck this. This isn't mine anymore. And she felt humiliated, she felt used, she felt like a child, she felt like a patient. And it was really sad. It was really sad to see. Well, she's doing well again now. She's back down to about 4 or 5 tablets a day. But that kind of supervision and medicalization just doesn't help. So I wanted to tell you that story. You get that all the time. I have colleagues in the UK. There is such a strong systemic supervisory system where addicts will come in and get their methadone or Subutex and go back out and come back in the next day and go back out, and it's a complete revolving door, and there's no sense of stopping. There's no idea of stopping. It's not about stopping. It's just about surviving. There's very little volition, creativity, energy. It's the way it is in a lot of Western and other countries. Okay, second thing we can do. So, extend the temporal horizon into the past and the future. So I was talking before about delay discounting or now appeal. Like, let's do some cocaine next week. No, let's do some cocaine this afternoon. So if addicts develop a cognitive style or cognitive frame of only thinking about today, or maybe at the most 1 or 2 days in the future, how do you get them to think about the extended future? How do you get them to imagine the extended future? And I think there's a way to do that, and it has to do, well, first of all, the main problem, of course, is saying no. How do addicts learn to say no? And how do they trust themselves to carry through? Because that's the only way they're going to start to change the future, yeah? How do they say no and believe that they can say no after they've failed and failed and failed and failed and failed again? Okay, so this idea of self-trust, I think, is extremely important for developing a future sense. And one way to think about that is this idea of developing a connection with the future self. There's a scholar named George Ainsley who talks about intertemporal dialogue, which means talking to yourself at a different age. So you now, at the age of whatever you are, 22 or whatever, talk to yourself at the age of 50. Well, there are experiments which morph your face so to show you what you look like at each decade of your life. Did you know that? You know, these face morphing programs that will age your face for you so that you can see what you're going to look like at 30 and 40 and 50 and 60. So in one classic experiment, they asked college students like you, how much money do you think you should put into your retirement every year or every month? And they say, 5% maybe. But then you show them pictures of what they're going to look like at the age of 65 or 70, and then they say, 50%. Okay, so you can actually manipulate people's sense of their future by various tricks. And all I want to do is give you the idea that it's hard to imagine your future, and it's especially hard to imagine your future if you are a drug addict or an alcoholic. And part of the problem, addicts have a hard time seeing their future as anyone but an addict, okay? And so if you want to trust your future self, that's kind of a problem because addicts are not trustworthy. So who do you trust? How can you trust a sense of who you're going to be if who you're going to be is logically who you already are? It's a real problem. It's a built-in cognitive puzzle. And who can you trust? If you can't trust yourself, well, you trust the thing you're addicted to, because that's the only thing you can trust. And self-trust is a really big problem for people in addiction. The belief that they can do it. There's a lot of work on that as well. Okay, so I want to say what we can do about that is help people see their life as a narrative. A narrative means a story, yeah? And there's been a certain amount of, actually quite a bit of work on the use of narrative in psychology and psychotherapy. Writing stories about yourself helps you to perceive yourself in new ways and helps you to change yourself. And James Pennebaker is a psychologist who really developed this idea in the greatest detail. So he gets his clients to go home and write every day about what they're going through and where they're going and how they're changing. And once you start to set up a storyline, then there is a sense of time, sense of a past and sense of a future, because that's the only way stories work. They go from one time to another time, point A to point B to point C. So how might that work? Well, first of all, help them see their life as a narrative which is embedded in their past, in their childhood, in their adolescence. Help them think about their childhood and their adolescence. What happened to them? What messed them up? What made things so difficult? What was it like being a teenager? What was it like being so alone and so frightened and so abused? Okay? And once people start to think about what it was like to be younger, they also start to think about what it's like to be older. It's an amazing thing. But if you can go back in time, you can also tend to go forward in time. So the idea, of course, is that you help them look at their past, and then you use the narrative storyline to say, okay, you've got a past, you've got a present, then you must have a future. And then perhaps you can start to think about that future. And what you're doing, of course, is you're using the prefrontal cortex, you're changing the circuitry in order to perceive yourself in a different way, not just as a drug addict or an alcoholic, but as someone who's going through a lifetime. And that change in perspective can be extremely powerful. And that's why people tend to quit on their own at, guess what age is most common for people to quit? What age would you think is most common for people to quit? Yeah. Very close. 28. Good. Yep. 20. Yeah, good enough. 28, 30. I was going to say 30. But indeed, as you're getting close to 30, you're starting to say, wait a minute, I'm not getting any younger. Right? So, and people who have binge drinking problems, for example, in their 20s, they often quit at the age of, in their early 30s. I quit at the age of 30, exactly. So you start to see your life in perspective, and that's powerful. What you're doing, again, is you are creating new connections, of course, between the striatum, the motivational center of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, the place where you do your planning and your thinking and your decision making. Okay, number 3, deal with adverse childhood experiences. So again, I want to talk about going into the past. How do you go into the past, especially when the past is so painful? We already saw these correlations between adverse childhood experiences and adult addiction. We saw those correlations. We know that there's a connection. We know that it's a strong correlation. Okay, but what do you do about it? I've been thinking a lot lately about the internal dialogue, because I think it's a very powerful way to understand how people relate to themselves. Okay, so I don't know what it's like in Norway, but I often ask people, do you have several voices in your head? And most people say, no, I'm not crazy. But then if you really ask them and say, well, come on, don't you ever feel like, don't you ever tell yourself, you're being a real jerk? Like, you are being a jerk. That was really stupid. That's another voice, right? So yeah, that's a voice in your head. And going back to Freud, we've had a superego and so forth and so on. So the idea of having different kinds of persona that are interacting in a sort of almost dialogical way is not really that crazy an idea. And many of us can tune into that internal dialogue quite easily. I don't know, does that idea seem familiar to you? Yeah? Good. Okay. So the most famous one is the internal critic, the hostile critical voice. You're an asshole. Why did you do that? Why did you say that? For example, like with my kids who are growing up, my wife sometimes says, don't talk to them like that, because if you talk to them like that, they're just going to not listen to you, and they're going to, start to ignore you because you're trying to tell them what to do and something, and they think they know what to do. And I do it anyway. And then I say, that was really stupid. You're an idiot. Okay, so that's an example. But we also have other internal voices, and one of my clients is quite interesting because he's got 4 or 5 internal voices that he gives names to. He's not psychotic, not at all. He doesn't have multiple personality disorder, not even close. But he has names for the different parts of himself. And he has a part of himself which is very sexual, and he sometimes calls it slutty Mao, because he does a lot of sexting and stuff and allows himself to be mistreated. And he has another part of himself which he calls Magic Mao, which helps him out when he gets very, very anxious and starts thinking about doing too much cocaine. And he has another voice called Ezra, which is soothing and says, it's okay, you can go home tonight and just relax and make something for dinner and then watch a movie and go to bed. Everything's going to be okay. And so these different voices are like different personalities. And as our therapy proceeds, it's really interesting that these personalities are actually changing. They're actually metamorphosizing. They're evolving. So for example, slutty Mao has now turned into sexual Mao. And my client has gone from sexting to actually having sex with real people, which, I don't know, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I think that's probably more satisfying. Ezra, the self-soothing, the compassionate inner voice, has become more of a background sense that he feels is more him now, rather than someone taking care of him. It's more like him taking care of himself. So there's all kinds of work on this these days, and one of my favorite approaches, at least this month, is called internal family systems. It's called internal family systems therapy. And the idea is, in family systems therapy, as you may have learned, or maybe you will learn, is, you try to understand what different members of the family, what roles they're taking, the identified patient, the accuser, the whatever. Different family members have different roles. In internal family systems, you break down the internal dialogue into different roles, and you try to get these parts to talk to each other. Well, in addiction, I think this is really, really important, because almost every addict I've ever talked to, maybe everyone, about this, will talk about their addict self. Most of the time I'm in control, but when at 5 o'clock when I pass by the bar, my addict self comes out and I can't say no. Well, what's that about? Is this voice really independent? Is this voice really, shut down the whole system? But they all talk about an addict self. People who are into drugs, people who are into drinking, people who are into porn, they talk about their addict self as though it were an independent being. Well, it's not an independent being. It's a part of yourself, obviously, but you can actually have a dialogue with it, and you can say, okay, I know you really want to get high, but can we just slow down for a minute and think about this? Like, if you get high, you're going to get hung over, and you're not going to be able to function tomorrow morning and whatever, and you're not going to have enough money, and you're going to have withdrawal symptoms, and you're going to get in trouble with whatever, your boyfriend, your wife, your husband. So is there something else that you could do to feel better? Oh, well, maybe we could, I don't know, go see a movie, or, do something, go play some games or whatever it is, something exciting, lose yourself so that you don't completely shut off the motivation to lose yourself, but you try to modulate it by having a dialogue. And this kind of therapy, IFS, you can go to the website, Internal Family Systems, advises therapists to help their clients have a dialogue among the voices. Talk to them, talk to each other, and most important, accept each other, and then probably even more important, forgive each other. So instead of the next morning saying, you fucking asshole, we had to get high again, instead of talking to yourself like that, saying, okay, so you messed up, but today's another day. And that makes a huge difference, because shame is toxic, right? We all know that. Shame is toxic. Shame makes you feel horrible. And when addicts berate themselves for their addiction, for doing it, they shame themselves, they make it harder and harder and harder to stop. Any thoughts, questions, or ideas about that? How many of you plan to be involved with actual clients in some kind of therapeutic work? A lot of you. A lot of you, okay. Well, there's lots going on these days. I think motivational interviewing, of course, ACT, do you know about ACT? Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. It's really a big one in the addiction world. ACT, they call it ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. It combines mindfulness and kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. And it appears to be very, very useful with addiction. And I think this internal family systems thing is pretty cool too. So what I'm saying is that what brings the damage forward from childhood into your present, from the past to the present, is this kind of internal dialogue, okay? You have all these nasty feelings. You have an internal self that is harsh and critical and shaming, yeah? And there's that little dialogue going on right there. It's a cycle, it's a feedback cycle within a larger feedback cycle. And I think that is why people continue to hate themselves and shame themselves, and therefore find relief in whatever drug or activity they're addicted to. Okay, it's hard to imagine those two having a decent conversation, but maybe they could start by at least turning around and looking at each other. Okay, so, as I just said, psychotherapy and or mindfulness meditation can bring the internal dialogue to the surface and foster self-acceptance and self-compassion and build self-trust. And these are really the two main techniques that people in psychology and the social services, people not in medicine, want to use, is psychotherapy techniques, there's all these kinds of psychotherapy techniques, and mindfulness meditation. And another word about mindfulness meditation, there's been a lot of work about that lately. How many people have heard of Jon Kabat-Zinn? Only just a couple. That's too bad. Jon Kabat-Zinn is the person who brought mindfulness from Buddhism to the West. Okay? Mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based work for depression, for anxiety. There's all these forms of therapy based on mindfulness. And they start with meditation, learning to meditate, kind of Buddhist meditation. So in addiction now, there's one called mindfulness-based relapse prevention. And it's centered in Seattle. A person named, what's her name? Sarah, it'll come back to me. Anyway, it's what they do is they train people who are addicted to drugs to meditate, to calm down, to breathe, to focus on their body. That's a good start, okay? And then comes the craving. And what they teach them to do is what's called urge surfing. An urge is like a craving, urge surfing, which means, okay, here it comes. It's like a wave. It gets bigger and bigger. It gets stronger and stronger. You really want it. You really want it. Just watch it because it's going to peak and then dissipate. That's what waves do. And that's what craving does too. If you don't go after the drug or drink or activity of choice, then the craving will, of course, slow down and dissipate. It must. You can't remain in that state for, forever. So they train people to use mindfulness to watch the wave, to let it happen, and to watch it. And then they learn that this is in fact a wave. It's not just going to go on forever, but it comes and goes. It's got a kind of rhythm of its own. And that way they can kind of hold on and not go plunging out and trying to buy drugs. Okay, so I think those are really cool approaches to helping people with addictions. 4, develop and practice cognitive tricks. I have learned this since I've been doing psychotherapy with people in addiction. I've been learning this more and more, that you need cognitive tricks because addiction is sneaky. And it kind of sneaks up and it's hard to, it kind of gets you when you're not looking. So for example, you're driving home from work and you drive past the liquor store and you just suddenly find, you're at a red light and there's the driveway of the parking lot to the liquor store, and suddenly your car's in the parking lot, and that's it, you're done. You're going to go home with a bottle of vodka. So addiction is sneaky that way. So what kind of tricks? Well, limit exposure to triggers. That's the first one. Help people learn to work around or bypass habit-maintaining cognitive cascades. And you can see why I use the word cascade. You've got a lovely cascade outside the window there, a waterfall. It's a cognitive process which tumbles on down through its own momentum, its own energy. And that's what it's like. Limit exposure to triggers. So instead of driving home by the liquor store, take another road. Take another street. Don't drive by the liquor store, okay? Don't have any booze at home. Get rid of it. Even if you get drunk one night, I tell my addict clients, I say, first of all, whether you drink or not tonight, I don't want you to be nasty to yourself. You should accept yourself and be nice to yourself and forgive yourself. So one of my clients says, you mean even like while I'm drinking, I should forgive myself? Yes, even while you're drinking, before, during, and after. Say, I'm drinking, so I'm getting smashed, I'm getting shit-faced, and I should forgive myself. Yes. You should forgive yourself. It's a hard thing to get in mind. But if you do that, and then, drunk enough and you can go to bed and stuff, you don't have as much shame and self-hatred left over the next day, and maybe you won't drink that much or drink anything the next day. So I think that's pretty important. But again, so the next day, what you should do is get rid of all the bottles of booze at home. Get rid of them, okay? Get rid of your dealer's phone number. Call your dealer and tell him or her that you can't ever buy from him or her again. I told one of my clients, I said, call your dealer and say that he was actually taking heroin and cocaine, so that's pretty serious, but tell your dealer that it is killing you and you are probably going to die soon and don't sell it to you anymore. Well, the dealer doesn't want you to die for all kinds of reasons, so this is a good way to break the connection. And again, these are all just ways to get rid of the triggers, to remove yourself from the source. The legal system tries to do that by prohibition, and it doesn't work. Because when you prohibit drugs, when you make them illegal, then they just get taken up by criminals who are much smarter than government agents anyway. So that doesn't work. You need to do it in a personal way with people and do it in accordance with their own lives and their own activities. Interrupt rumination and catastrophizing. So, I think that's self-evident. People in addiction will tend to think about it and think about it and think about it and hurt themselves and be mean to themselves, and it just keeps going. Think about something else. Learn distraction. Distraction is an incredibly effective tool. It's the first tool that your mother taught you to keep you from crying when you were 3 months old. Distraction. People forget how to do it, but it's very useful. Interrupt rumination and catastrophizing. And 3, plan alternative activities. So again, plan alternative activities. That sounds so simple, but the idea is that when people are told or tell themselves to stop taking drugs or drinking, it's like, okay, I have to not do this anymore. The goal is to not do anything. And that's impossible. The dopamine cannot help you not do something. Dopamine is moving you towards doing something, not doing something. Okay? So you have to find an alternative activity. And I think that there's a lot of thinking to be done about this. As a therapist, the way I see it, the stronger the habit strength, the stronger the addiction, the more immediate the alternative has to be. Okay? So if you got someone who really is taking, bad drugs every day, then you need to give them an alternative that is not going to be out of reach, but it's going to be right there available. Like someone to call, a movie to watch, a book to read, a place to go, a restaurant to go to, even another drug. I mean, for some people who have drug addictions, I say, okay, what you should go and do is go and have a beer. That's not the AA way. I realize that. But it can work, because if you're not an alcoholic, if you like heroin or methamphetamine instead, going out and having a beer could be a really good alternative reinforcement, and it may be a lot better for you. So give them something else to shoot for right away. And if they're less addicted, that is to say if things are getting better for them and the habit strength is reduced, then the alternative rewards can be more distal. It can be more other things, plan a trip, go away with your wife or husband or kids or whatever, go camping, climb a mountain, stuff that's not immediately available but that you can plan. Okay? These are all simple things, right? Just simple logical things. Again, I like little brain diagrams. Again, you are just reconnecting. Instead of ignoring the striatum, instead of ignoring this part of your brain that's been around for 500 million years, use it, but use it to do something which is less destructive. And that means you need to alter your planning, your thinking, your perspective taking, your decision making, prefrontal activities. Okay, so that's pretty much the way I approach things in addiction, trying to help people. In some, I want to go for a reinterpretation and understanding of one's past through remembering and living through painful experiences and letting them come up, letting them surface, letting them not be so hidden and so powerful, which allows for self-acceptance and self-compassion. Self-compassion, very important. It was really horrible being, a teenager and being alone and being scared and being driven to prostitution or whatever it was, or being raped or whatever it was. So let it come and let the self-compassion come, and then you can start to be in yourself, in the moment, in the present. And once you can be in yourself in the present, then you can think about changing the future. Okay, so that's it. That's my recipe. And yeah, you try to develop the cognitive flexibility to learn to do that through being clever, being more clever than your addiction. Okay, so then I would end by saying treatment works by connecting empowerment to the future self, your own goals, empowerment to the future self, which means connecting the striatum to the prefrontal cortex, again, in a different way, which also means connecting the self with the social world, again, in a different way, in a new way, opening up connections that weren't there before. And the alternatives which are available in our culture seem to be the conventional disease model rehab, which is based on medication and good old AA. Or, a medicalization, or psychological tools. such as cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, ACT, psychodynamic therapy, mindfulness, meditation, contingency management. There's so many. Compassion-focused therapy. I can't even read that. Social support and scaffolding. And now I like internal family systems as a very innovative new therapeutic approach. So I think that those are much more powerful tools to help people get beyond their addiction. And remember, the brain never stops changing. Okay. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Very happy to.
So did this make sense to you? There's a question, 2 questions up here. Can you, if I throw it to you?
How are you guys at basketball?
Yeah, we should. And then there's some people up here.
Hello.
Hey.
Have you done any work with psychedelics in the treatment of addictions?
Not myself, no. But I have gone to a few ayahuasca ceremonies, and I know that ayahuasca, the psychedelic of the present era, can be very, very powerful in helping people change their lives in all kinds of ways, whether it's depression, whether it's addiction, and so on and so forth. I'm too old to do any more ayahuasca, but it was pretty amazing. But there's a lot of that going on in psychiatry now with psilocybin and MDMA, using these drugs, which might be considered party drugs or recreational drugs, to help people with depression, with addiction, with anxiety, with pain, with chronic pain. And there's lots of research showing how effective they are. A single dose of psilocybin, a single psilocybin session can be enough to reverse a major depressive disorder. So I think it's great stuff. Very promising.
There was someone up there.
Hello.
Hey.
I just wanted to say that it doesn't have to be a polarization between the two solutions to the problem. I think you can have both medication and doctors, as well as your psychological tools to accomplish the goal. So it doesn't need to be either or, but both.
Medication.
Like Winnie the Pooh, you have ja takk, begge deler.
I totally agree in the case of opioid addiction. Opioids, right?
No, I was thinking about alcohol also. For instance, the medication Antabus, I think it can work quite well. It has good side effects also.
You're right. You're right. They can work together. I'm making a more extreme case. It's true. But there, again, I would see that the medication is an adjunct to therapy. I wouldn't necessarily see it as the main act. Like, when people think about medication and addiction, they normally think about methadone and buprenorphine, right? Subutex. That's the drama, the opioid epidemic, the overdose epidemic. And I strongly support the use of methadone and Subutex for people who are addicted to opioids, because the alternative is basically heroin and much, much higher risk of overdose. So yes, they should then have both. With alcohol, yeah, antabuse, I don't know. Yeah, it does work for some people. I don't know what the percentages are.
Me neither.
Okay.
But I think it can work for some people then.
Yeah.
Because you have this, what you call it, placebo effect. Even if you think it can't work, it kind of scares you away from it, because you think that this nausea is terrible. I don't know if it is, but it might be, according to the doctors.
That's a very good point. The placebo effect, the famous placebo effect. This is a big deal with antidepressants. When they do these controlled studies comparing SSRIs with placebos, they find that the placebos are almost as effective as the SSRIs for people with depression. If you've taken something which makes you feel like you're going to do better, and that's what a placebo effect is, then you often do better, which is kind of like how drug use works. Being a drug addict. But no, it's, yes, you're right. That taking things that make you feel, okay, if I take this, I'm going to not need to drink, that can be a very valuable placebo effect, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, come on. We have some time. What else? Someone over there?
Do you think that if we can stop the criminalization of drugs, that could help? What's it called? Reducing the addiction.
Say the first part again.
Do you think that if we stop criminalization of the drug use?
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that before, right? And criminalization doesn't help at all. I mean, in the U.S., it's a horrendous problem. There's a huge number of people in prison simply for using drugs. I mean, it's a disgrace. It's just a disgrace. So they come out and they're in much worse shape than when they went in. Now, whether or not we should put dealers in prison or not, that's another matter. And the difference between decriminalization and legalization is a big debate for some people. I personally think decriminalization is definitely the way to go. I even think legalization is probably going to be, in the long run, is probably going to be the best solution, because that means that drug use can be controlled so that kids, so that 13-year-olds can't go and buy heroin. I mean, right? If you can only get it from a certain source and it's only for people of a certain age or a certain condition, then it's gotta be helpful in certain ways.
Yeah.
Do you think there is a correlation between ACE experiences and other addictions like gambling or porn?
Yeah, good question. The question is whether there's a correlation between these ACE experiences, adverse childhood experiences, and behavioral addictions like gambling. The adverse childhood experiences literature it was a huge survey analysis, which started off with something like 17,000 participants, and it's had several waves, I think, and it leads to all kinds of negative outcomes. Addiction is just one of them. I mean, substance addiction is just one of them. It also leads to poor health outcomes, physical health outcomes. So people who have had more crummy experiences in their childhood and adolescence will tend to die sooner, die younger. They will tend to have poorer employment opportunities, poorer marriage outcomes, poorer relationship outcomes, poorer friendship outcomes, like everything. Every indicator of successful functioning is correlated with adverse childhood experiences. Addiction is just one of them. Yeah. There's a study in Britain, I can't remember the details now, but it basically compared the workers who were kind of low on the totem pole, who were basically not very respected, doing menial jobs, no one looking up to them, no one showing appreciation, comparing them to people in a managerial role and controlling for all other variables and finding all of the same kinds of differences. So the conclusion was that your social status, your place in the dominance hierarchy, we are apes, and we have dominance hierarchies. And the lower you are in the dominance hierarchy, the worse things are going to be for you in general. You're going to have worse luck at mating and having children and having wealth and having acquisition and having health and all the rest of it. So it's a sad, shall we say, factor in being human, and one that we, of course, try to equalize as much as we can.
Do you believe in addictive genes?
No, the genetic picture is so messy. Simple answer, no. But what I would say is that there are personality dispositions, personality traits that clearly have genetic links. You know this from twin studies. For example, impulsive personality is partly genetic. Well, if you're impulsive, you're more likely to try drugs when you're an adolescent. If you're more likely to try them, then you're more likely to get addicted. So there's going to be a correlation between impulsive personality disorder and addiction. But the idea that there's an addictive gene per se, or an addictive cluster of genes, doesn't make very much sense. No one's found it. It doesn't look like anything. Rather, it's these different personality factors which contribute to difficulties over development, and which then lead to addiction as a result. Okay. Someone had a question here?
Yeah, I was just wondering if, what do you think of the Norwegian system or healthcare in the USA, you probably have a different way to approach users than the Norwegians do.
Probably.
Yeah.
They do. I'm not American.
Yeah.
I'm Canadian.
Yeah, but what do you think of
They
the
put them in
Norwegian-
jail,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, but the treatment, do they have other treatments? What do you think of the treatment?
Oh, the treatment system is a mess in the U.S. It's a terrible mess. There's a lot of private residential treatment centers that have very low outcome success. Revolving door, people go back again and again and again. You could talk about this for hours. Some of them are incredibly expensive. They're not well regulated. They don't have good outcome statistics. They have recruiters that go and find people because the owners of these centers get money from insurance companies for treating people even though they're not helping them. They sometimes can get more drug availability at the treatment centers than not. And I think one of the worst things about residential treatment is that you put someone in residential treatment for 1 month or 3 months, their chances of overdosing, if they're an opioid addict, are substantially higher when they leave than when they went in. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
Why would you think that would be?
Do they need a longer time, you think, or do
They're
they?
doing treatment off drugs for 1 month or 3 months, and they come out and they have a much better chance of overdosing. Why? Tolerance. Yeah. Their tolerance has gone down. The first time they shoot heroin, they die. Or take other opioids. But it's not only tolerance. It's also that they have not, they forgot how to deal with, sitting in their lonely little apartment in downtown and being able to negotiate their moods and their experiences without the use of drugs. So they often will plunge back into drugs or drinking, at least as even with more intensity than they did in the first place. People recover. One set of statistics shows that people recover the most, not in treatment, but between the time they call and the time that they're accepted. Do you know that? It's in that book, Inside Rehab, by Ann Fletcher. People are most likely to recover between the time they pick up the phone and call to get treatment and, you have to wait for 3 months. So that's the time in which they stop, not once they're in treatment. Empowerment comes from the self. Yeah. About the gateway theory. What do I think about the gateway theory? So like marijuana is a gateway to all other drugs? Yeah, no. Swimming is a gateway to diving. Diving is more dangerous than swimming, but most swimmers don't become divers. I don't think much of it. It's natural that people will take, if you look at the picture in retrospect, if you start with heroin addicts and you say, okay, you take get a room of 100 heroin addicts, well, it turns out, yes, indeed, 93 of them started with marijuana. Of course they did, because that was what was available when they were 14 or 15 or 16. But if you look at it the other way around and take 100 marijuana smokers when they're 15 or 16 and ask how many of them are going to be heroin addicts, it's a very small number. So people play with statistics and can make up all kinds of stories. Another question? Oh, well, okay, no basketball for you.
I am engaged both in the university but also in politics, so I just want to ask you for a brief comment on Karl Marx's famous claim that the religion is opiate to society.
Yes,
if
the
it's
opiate of the people.
appropriate.
Well, I already said religion is probably a disease. What can I say? Yes, and I think we see actually, to take it seriously, in the US right now, there's a real breakdown of the social structure, which I'm sure is obvious to Europeans because of the person who's running the place, Donald Trump, right? This is a travesty. And why? Well, because as cultural traditions break down, all Americans had left to give their lives meaning was religion. And there's a lot of churches in the US, just as many churches as in Europe. The difference is that people actually go to church in the US. They do. And there's so many kinds of Protestantism, which is quite severe, quite strict, and orthodox, and stuff like that. Well, now that religion itself is breaking down, and people, now that we understand more about science and evolution, and all these religious myths are breaking down, people are left with like no meaning in their lives. They don't know what the hell to do. You mean I'm not going to go to heaven? Like, okay, well, maybe not. And so I think that that creates enormous social problems. And part of those problems lead into things like the opioid epidemic and other forms of addiction and other negative outcomes.